about were involved in that first study. And in that study, they obtained informed consent from the individuals who were participating in that study. So they were advised as to what the nature of the study was, what their participation in the study was, what the risks of the study were, and there was significant conversation about the need for informed consent from the patients of that study. And that's an important precursor to this study by contrast, given that it was the same researchers building on the Terre Haute studies.
This is the critical point, that this was a study done by informed consent and was voluntary. Now, people at the time and in retrospect, one can question how voluntary this really was. It was deemed acceptable to pay the prisoners for their participation. No promises about leniency were made. Strong arguments that this would be a patriotic thing to do were made, and that could affect perhaps leniency down the road. So the degree to which there was truly freedom of choice to say yes or no, I think, is still debatable. But this study clearly established the principle of mandatory informed consent of some type before an invasive experiment of this type. And that was 1943, so 3 years before this began. And as Nita states correctly, some of the individuals, and particularly John Cutler, who was a very young investigator at that time, and even in Guatemala was a figure in the Terre Haute studies. So, when the Clinton and Sebelius apology came, this made big news, and it was hard to escape reading about this in the newspapers. And this is the note from the president asking us to carry out these 3 charges. What happened? Could it happen again? Let's get international buy-in on these opinions. So we broke up the president's charge into 2 different studies. The first is an understanding of what happened, and it is here where a deep dig into what is left of the original data was done by the staff of the commission, who did a magnificent job. And the second that I'll speak about very briefly is a project that we are actually underway with right now. And I think we all are sleep deprived because of this, which is the contemporary review. So we have open meetings. We had 4 public meetings to review what happened in Guatemala and to review the contemporary standards with the International Subcommittee. The last of the 4 meetings will be next week or in 10 days in Boston. Was it 10 days? 1 week?
Yeah, not very soon. Yeah.
So what did our staff do? They reviewed 125,000 pages of original records, over 500 published documents. They consulted with experts, and they tried to prepare organized databases of exactly what was done to which subjects in Guatemala. And, you know, with the passage of time, with 60 years passing, with only 1 individual who was involved alive, with this individual's memory not very clear, this wasn't a central player in the events. The documentary evidence really is, despite all of this work, a little bit scattered and incomplete. But we know enough to make some pretty powerful conclusions. So exactly what happened? Well, as I mentioned, there were intentional exposure studies conducted between 46 and 48. Blood draws over a longer period of time, 46 to 53. how were these intentional exposures done? Through sexual intercourse with sex workers who had been inoculated intentionally, or who were known to be carriers of syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid. And it's worth restating that the goal of the original study, why we were doing this, was to see if this topical followed by silver injection prophylaxis could prevent transmission of sexually transmissible diseases. But in order to do that, obviously, you had to have a model, and in this case, a human model, where the transmission was happening. There was also an intention to see if the new antibiotics were actually useful in the immediate post-exposure environment. But in fact, neither of these aims were ever really studied in this series of experiments.
Wait, before you go on, Steve, let me build on that for 1 minute, right? So that, because we've read this, the details about this. Something that was unique about Guatemala was that there were commercial sex workers, meaning that it was legal to have commercial sex workers come into the prisons and have sex with the prisoners. And that's one of the things that made Guatemala seem like an ideal place to study from the perspective of the researchers. The Guatemalan government worked in cooperation with the United States government and invited them into this prison population. And just to underscore what Steve said about the commercial sex workers, part of the process of being a commercial sex worker is that they underwent and they had frequent examinations done to ensure, really, that they weren't passing sexually transmitted diseases onto the people with whom they were having sex. But instead, what was happening was they were being intentionally infected with gonorrhea or syphilis in order to then transmit it or have a better human model in order to transmit it to the prisoners. And this was done with, as far as we can tell from the documentation, entirely without their knowledge. So they were undergoing examinations purportedly for their health and to ensure that they didn't have any sort of diseases and instead were being infected. And then were going into the prisons and having sex with the prisoners, many in a row. So it was not, long-term courtships with the prisoners, but, a sex worker who would service many different people within the prison on the same day with the idea to try to infect them through natural methods.
So it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Because of the Terre Haute failure that was quickly replicated in Guatemala, it was clear that just sexual activity was insufficient for a reproducible model of transmission. So they had to go further. They went to direct injections, to scarring and abrading the genital regions, and then to direct inoculation of syphilis organisms through the neck into the central nervous system, something that we call a cisternal puncture. The populations exposed to various elements of these procedures were commercial sex workers, the prisoners, Guatemalan soldiers, and also psychiatric hospital patients. There were also blood draws being done, certainly without consent, but less less horrible, just to draw blood, to look for serologic evidence of exposure to venereal diseases. And those populations were mostly from the intentional exposure studies, but also children from the orphanage and school, from an orphanage and school, patients with leprosy, and U.S. Air Force personnel.
And part of the theory for these draws were to try to have a background understanding of what the incidence of syphilis or these types of STDs were in the general population, because they were trying to compare the inoculation rates and also the effectiveness of the conditions, of the treatments against a background.
I say we because these were American studies, were trying to establish whether Guatemalans had the same immune responses as Westerners. There was a belief that somehow they were so different that the assays that were developed in the Western world would not be useful in this population that was so different. And that, I think, illustrates some of the thinking that was behind these studies. Cutler and others were also very interested in culturing syphilis, especially in rabbits, and wanted to know if syphilis lost its virulence when it was cultured in rabbits. So he would be inoculating people with rabbit-cultured or human-obtained syphilis organisms to see if the antibody responses were different. So there were a number of different related studies. Yes, sir?
Chronologically speaking, the time these studies were done, was the knowledge of what went on in the Nazi death camps with human experimentation known at the time?
So these were at the time of the Nuremberg trials, yes. But I don't know if I have this on a slide. Let me just see. So let me just say a few words about this. After I speak about this, there were no records that any of the subjects gave consent. Some subjects, including those with mental illness and children, clearly were incapable of consent. And evidence very clearly shows that researchers intentionally deceived some subjects about the nature of the study and what was being done to them. Now, Terre Haute, for all its issues, was relatively open. This study was approved by giants of American science and medicine, people who were heroes of mine before I joined this commission. Vannevar Bush. Any MIT people here? Vannevar Bush, a legendary president of MIT and science advisor. Thomas Rivers from Rockefeller University, who is the godfather of understanding autoimmune neurologic problems and how vaccines cause complications. These were giant figures. They approved this, and throughout the documents that could be reviewed, there were warnings, not from Bush, but from others, stating it's fine to do this, but keep it quiet. It's best not for this not to be known because it wouldn't be understood by people. And one of the principles of ethics that you don't need an ethicist to help us with is transparency. Something that is okay to be on the front page of the paper that supports your institution least is probably okay. And something that you don't want revealed is not okay. Science cannot work in secrecy. But a decision was made here that secrecy was needed because people wouldn't understand the subtleties of this and the importance of it.